The morning sun burned across the Arizona desert, casting jagged shadows over cracked earth and sagebrush. John Harper urged his horse forward, the leather of his saddle creaking beneath him. He had been tracking 3 stray calves for hours, their hoofprints weaving through the valley's red dust. The air tasted of heat and iron, and the distant howl of a coyote sent a shiver down his spine despite the warmth. At 42, John knew this land's cruelty, its thirst for blood, its hunger for hope. Yet nothing in his 20 years of ranching prepared him for what lay ahead. A shape loomed on the horizon, unnatural against the desert's endless sprawl. At first he thought it a mirage, a trick of light on weary eyes. But as he drew closer, the truth sharpened into focus. A wooden cross, 10 feet tall, driven deep into the earth. Its beams were smooth, polished by careful hands, not the hasty work of outlaws. Tied to it, her thin wrists bound by coarse rope, was a girl, no older than 12. Her dress hung in tatters, streaked with dirt and dried blood. A wooden sign dangled from her neck, its carved words searing into John's mind. "Return when you are perfect." His breath caught, a fist tightening in his chest. The girl's eyes, wide and glassy, locked onto his. They held terror, yes, but also a flicker of something else. Hope, fragile as a candle in a storm. Her lips were cracked, her small frame trembling from exhaustion. The rope had bitten into her skin, leaving raw, weeping wounds. John spurred his horse forward, his pulse hammering. In all his years he had seen death. Apache raids, cattle rustlers, men broken by the desert's madness. But this was no accident. This was evil, deliberate, and cloaked in righteousness. "Hold on, little one," he said, his voice low, steady as he dismounted. His boots crunched against the earth, each step deliberate to avoid startling her. The girl's gaze followed him, unblinking, her chest rising and falling in shallow gasps. John drew his knife, its blade glinting in the sunlight, and began sawing at the ropes. They were thick, knotted with precision, and bore faint stains. Old blood, he realized, his stomach twisting. This cross had held others before her. The ropes fell away, and the girl collapsed into his arms, light as a sparrow. Her body shook, her skin cold despite the desert's heat. John wrapped her in his coat, its rough wool swallowing her frail form. "You are safe now," he whispered, though the words felt hollow. The desert stretched endlessly around them, its silence a lie. Wagon tracks, fresh but fading in the wind, led east toward the mountains. Whoever had done this was gone, but not far. John lifted her onto his horse, her weight barely registering. As he settled her in front of him, he noticed the cross again. Its base was sunk deep, the earth around it packed tight. This was no temporary marker. It was permanent, a shrine to suffering. The girl stirred, her fingers clutching his coat. When she looked up, her eyes held a shadow that chilled him. Not just fear, but recognition. She knew her tormentors, and she knew they would return. The ride to John's ranch took an hour, the sun climbing higher, its glare relentless. His home sat in a valley cradled by red canyon walls, a sturdy house of timber and stone that had weathered storms and solitude. It had been his sanctuary, a place to escape the ghosts of his past, a brother lost to fever, a life left behind in the east. But as he carried the girl through the door, that sanctuary shattered. She was not just hurt, she was broken, her spirit frayed by horrors he could only imagine. He set her in a kitchen chair, its wood creaking under her slight weight. She curled into herself, knees drawn to her chest, eyes darting to every window, every shadow. John moved to the pump, filling a tin cup with water. "Here," he said, offering it slowly. Her hands, marked with precise scars, too deliberate to be random, trembled as she gripped the cup. She drank in small, desperate sips, wincing as the water touched her raw throat. "What is your name?" John asked, kneeling to her level. His voice was gentle, but his mind raced. The scars, the rope burns, the sign, they painted a picture of systematic cruelty. The girl opened her mouth, but no sound came. She touched her throat, her face twisting in pain, then shook her head. Her voice was gone, stolen by screams or worse. John's jaw tightened, anger flaring in his chest. He had seen men lose their humanity in this desert, but this was different. This was a child. "You do not have to talk," he said, his eyes softening. "But if someone is looking for you, if they hurt you, I need to know." Her gaze flicked to the window, toward the mountains where the tracks had led. She held up 5 fingers, then pointed to herself. John frowned. 5 people? She shook her head, tears welling, and gestured again, 5 fingers, then to herself. 5 children? He asked, dread settling like ice in his veins. She nodded, and the tears spilled over. John stood, pacing to the window. The desert stared back, its vastness hiding secrets he was only beginning to grasp. 5 children, taken, tortured, maybe worse. And this girl, number 1, she had indicated, was the first. How long had she endured? What had she seen? He turned back to her, her small form hunched in the chair. She clutched the cup, her knuckles white. Then, slowly, she opened her hand, revealing a carved bone shaped like a lamb. Words were burned into its side. "The pure shall inherit." John's throat went dry. This was not just cruelty. This was religion, twisted into something monstrous. And somewhere in those mountains, 4 other children waited for the same fate that had nearly claimed this girl. The air grew heavy, the silence of the house broken only by her ragged breathing. Outside, the wind howled, carrying the scent of dust and danger. Whoever had left her on that cross would come looking. And when they did, John knew the desert would demand its due. The kitchen was dim, its walls bathed in the amber glow of a single oil lamp. John Harper stood by the window, the carved bone lamb still clutched in his calloused hand. Its weight felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the sins of the men who had crafted it. Outside, the Arizona desert stretched toward the mountains, their jagged peaks clawing at a sky bruised with dusk. The girl, whose name he still did not know, sat huddled in the chair, her eyes fixed on the floor. Her silence was a wound, raw and bleeding, and John felt its ache in his own chest. He turned to her, softening his voice. "You need rest, little one. But first, let me tend to those wounds." He moved to a cupboard, pulling out a tin of salve and a clean cloth. The girl flinched as he approached, her body tensing like a deer sensing a predator. John paused, kneeling a safe distance away. "I will not hurt you," he said, holding out the cloth like an offering. Her gaze flickered to his face, searching for truth. Slowly, she nodded, extending her wrists. The rope burns were deep, the skin torn and crusted with blood. John worked carefully, dabbing salve with a gentleness that belied his rough hands. Each touch drew a wince from her, but she did not pull away. As he wrapped her wrists in cloth, memories stirred, unwelcome, sharp. His brother, Michael, had been 14 when fever took him, his body wasting away in a Boston tenement. John, barely 20, had held his hand, promising safety he could not deliver. That failure had driven him west, to this desert where he thought he could outrun guilt. Now, tending to this girl, he felt Michael's ghost watching, urging him not to fail again. "You are strong," he said, tying off the bandage. "Stronger than they know." Her eyes met his, and for a moment the fear in them softened. She pointed to the bone lamb on the table, then to herself, holding up one finger. John nodded. You were the first.
And there are 4 others out there, she confirmed with a nod, her lips trembling. He leaned closer. Can you show me where? She hesitated, then pointed to the window toward the mountains.
Her hand shook, and she curled it into a fist, as if to trap the fear inside. John stood, his mind racing. The wagon tracks, the bone carving, the cross. They pointed to something organized, not the work of lone madmen. He crossed to a wooden chest in the corner, its lid scarred from years of use. Inside were papers, tools, and a faded wanted poster he had pinned to his wall months ago. He pulled it free, the paper crinkling under his fingers. The face staring back was Elias Ward, a preacher banished from Kansas and Nevada for unholy practices with children. His white beard and pale eyes were unmistakable, a mask of piety hiding something vile. John's blood ran cold. This was the man who had taken her. He held the poster out. Is this him? The girl's eyes widened, her breath catching. She nodded vigorously, then touched her chest, as if the memory of Ward's cruelty lived in her bones. John's jaw tightened. Ward was no ordinary predator. He wove scripture into his crimes, believing himself chosen. The bone lamb, the cross, the talk of perfection, it was his gospel, twisted and profane. Tell me what you can, John said, sitting across from her. Anything about him? About the others? She could not speak, but her hands moved with purpose. She held up 5 fingers again, then mimed a circle, pointing to herself and the imaginary others. 5 children kept together. She tapped her temple, then shook her head, her face contorting. They hurt your mind? John asked. She nodded, tears spilling. Then she pointed east, toward the mountains, and held up both hands, opening and closing them 3 times. 30 days. She had been with Ward for a month, and in that time he had taken 4 more. John's anger flared, a fire in his chest. He stood, pacing to the window. The mountains loomed, their shadows swallowing the last light. Devil's Canyon, a maze of rock and ravine, was 5 miles east. Apache had once hidden there, untouchable by cavalry. It was the perfect lair for a man like Ward, who thrived in darkness. John grabbed his spyglass from a shelf, its brass cool against his palm. Stay here, he told the girl, stepping outside. The air was sharp, carrying the scent of creosote and dust. He climbed onto the roof, the ladder creaking under his weight. From this vantage, the desert unfolded like a map of secrets. Through the spyglass, he scanned the horizon. A glint of metal flashed near a red mesa, followed by a thin thread of gray smoke curling into the sky. A camp, not small, hidden in the canyon's folds. Ward was there, with the other children, and he was not alone. John descended, his boots heavy on the rungs. Back inside, the girl was standing by his rifle rack, her small hand pointing to the wanted poster now lying on the table. Her eyes were urgent, pleading. She knew Ward's face, his power. She also knew he would come for her. John crossed to her, kneeling again. He will not touch you, he said, his voice firm. Not while I am here. But her gaze darted to the door, her body trembling. She had heard something, a sound too faint for John's ears, or perhaps the echo of her own fear. He followed her gaze, his hand resting on the rifle. The house was still, but the desert was not. A distant rumble, like hooves or wind, stirred the air. John's pulse quickened. He had brought this girl to safety, but safety was a lie in a land where men like Elias Ward walked free. The bone lamb sat on the table, its carved words mocking him. The pure shall inherit. To Ward, purity meant submission, and this girl, number 1, had defied him. That made her dangerous. That made her a target. John looked at her, her scarred hands clutching the chair, her eyes holding a courage she did not yet recognize. You fought to survive, he said. Now we fight together." She nodded, a single, resolute motion. But as the lamp flickered, casting shadows across the room, John felt the weight of the night pressing in. Ward was out there, his men watching, waiting. And in the silence of the desert, the hoofbeats grew louder. The desert night was alive with whispers, wind hissing through sagebrush, the distant cry of an owl slicing the silence. John Harper stood on his porch, the spyglass still warm in his hand from his earlier vigil. The smoke he had seen rising from Devil's Canyon haunted him, a gray specter curling against the starlit sky. 5 miles away, in that maze of rock and shadow, Elias Ward held 4 children captive, their fates bound to the girl now trembling inside his home. John's chest tightened, the carved bone lamb's words echoing in his mind. "The pure shall inherit." To Ward, purity was a chain, and those children were his prisoners. Inside, the girl sat by the kitchen table, her bandaged wrists glowing pale in the lamplight. She had not moved since pointing to the wanted poster, her eyes fixed on the door as if expecting Ward to materialize. John stepped back into the house, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. "You need sleep," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "I will keep watch." Her gaze flicked to him, wide and untrusting, but she nodded, exhaustion winning over fear. He led her to a small bedroom, its quilted bed a relic of a life he had left behind. She curled into the blankets, her small form swallowed by their weight, but her eyes remained open, staring at the ceiling. John returned to the kitchen, his rifle leaning against the wall. The wanted poster of Elias Ward lay on the table, its edges curling like burned skin. The preacher's pale eyes seemed to follow him, a challenge from miles away. John's fingers traced the rifle's stock, its wood worn smooth by years of use. He had fought men before, outlaws, rustlers, Apache warriors who knew the desert's secrets better than he ever would. But Ward was different. His weapons were not just guns but words, twisted into a gospel that justified his cruelty. John needed to know more, to see the canyon for himself. He grabbed his coat and spyglass, then paused by the bedroom door. The girl's breathing was shallow but steady, a fragile rhythm. "I will be back before dawn," he whispered, though she could not hear. Stepping outside, he saddled his horse, the animal's warmth grounding him against the night's chill. The desert stretched before him, its red canyon walls looming like sentinels. He rode east, the hoofbeats muffled by dust, his eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. The rumble he had heard earlier, hooves or wind, had faded, but the memory of it kept his senses sharp. Devil's Canyon was a labyrinth, its narrow passages carved by centuries of wind and water. John tethered his horse at its edge, where a cluster of mesquite offered cover. The air was heavy with the scent of stone and creosote, the ground littered with shale that crunched under his boots. He climbed a low ridge, his spyglass trained on the mesa where he had seen the smoke. The night was clear, the stars a cold fire overhead. Through the lens, he spotted the camp, a cluster of tents nestled against a rock face, their canvas glowing faintly from within. Shadows moved, too many for a small group. Ward's men, at least a dozen, patrolled the perimeter, their rifles glinting in the moonlight. John's breath caught as he adjusted the spyglass. Near the camp's center stood another cross, smaller than the one in the desert but no less sinister. It was empty, but ropes dangled from its beams, swaying in the breeze. His stomach twisted. The children were there, hidden in those tents, their lives hanging on Ward's whims. He scanned for any sign of them, a small figure, a cry, but the camp was disciplined, its silence unnatural. A fire burned low, its embers casting long shadows that danced like specters. One figure stood apart, tall and bearded, his staff topped with a carved lamb. Elias Ward. Even from this distance, his presence was a weight, a darkness that seemed to bend the air around him. John lowered the spyglass, his hands trembling with anger. Ward was not just a man, he was a force, a preacher who believed God whispered in his ear. The children were not just captives, but symbols of his warped salvation. John's mind raced back to the girl, her scars, her silence, her fear. She had survived a month with Ward, seen things that stole her voice. What was he doing to the others? John's grip tightened on the spyglass. He wanted to charge the camp, to tear it apart with his bare hands, but he was one man against many. Patience, the desert's cruelest lesson, was his only ally now. He descended the ridge, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had seen. As he reached his horse, a sound stopped him, a faint rustle, not the wind. He drew his revolver, its barrel cold against his palm, and scanned the darkness. A jackrabbit darted from a bush, its eyes flashing in the starlight. John exhaled, but the unease lingered. Ward's men were close, their camp a hive of vigilance. If they knew the girl had escaped, they would come for her. And John's ranch, his sanctuary, was no fortress. The ride back was swifter, driven by urgency. The sky was lightening, a thin band of gray creeping over the horizon. As he approached the ranch, the house stood quiet, its windows dark. Too quiet. John dismounted, his revolver still in hand, and moved to the door. It was ajar, the latch unhooked. His pulse surged. He had locked it before leaving. Stepping inside, he swept the kitchen with his eyes. The lamp was out, the wanted poster gone from the table. The bone lamb remained, its carved words mocking the silence. He crossed to the bedroom, his boots silent on the floor. The bed was empty, the quilt thrown back. Panic clawed at his chest. "Little one?" he called, his voice low. No answer. He checked the corners, the wardrobe, under the bed. Nothing. The back window was open, its frame splintered where the latch had been forced. Tracks led outside, small and uneven, joined by larger boot prints. The girl had fled, and someone had followed. John ran to the backyard, the dawn's first light revealing the truth. The girl's tracks led toward the canyon wall behind the house, a steep climb to caves where she might hide. The boot prints, heavy, deliberate, pursued her, their stride too long for a child. One of Ward's men, or Ward himself. John's blood ran cold. He grabbed his rifle from the kitchen and sprinted toward the rocks, his shoulder aching from the weight of the weapon. The girl was out there, alone, her courage pushing her to run but her body weak from trauma. As he reached the canyon wall, a cry pierced the air, high, desperate, unmistakably hers. It came from a ledge above, where a narrow cave mouth gaped like a wound in the rock. John climbed, his hands scraping against shale, his breath ragged. The boot prints stopped at the base, but a shadow moved on the ledge. A man, his back to John, rifle raised toward the cave. "Come out, lamb," the man called, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "The Lord's work is not done." John recognized the voice from the wanted poster's description. Thomas Reed, Ward's loyal enforcer. He aimed his rifle, his finger steady on the trigger. The girl was in that cave, her life hanging on John's next move. But the dawn was breaking, and with it, the desert's secrets were unraveling. Ward's camp was awake, and the hoofbeats John had heard in the night were no longer distant. They were coming. The desert dawn painted the canyon walls in hues of blood and gold, but John Harper felt only the chill of dread. He crouched behind a boulder, his rifle trained on Thomas Reed, who stood on the ledge above, his voice slithering into the cave where the girl hid. "Your pride will not save you, lamb," Reed called, his tone a sickening blend of patience and threat. "Return to the fold, or the Lord's wrath will find you." John's finger hovered over the trigger, his pulse a steady drum. The girl's cry had stopped, but her silence was louder, a plea for rescue. He could not shoot yet, not without risking her safety. The cave was narrow, and a stray bullet could ricochet. John's eyes darted to the horizon. The hoofbeats he had heard were closer now, a low rumble rising from the east. Elias Ward's men, drawn by the girl's escape or Reed's pursuit. Time was slipping away, the desert tightening its grip. John shifted, his boots silent on the shale, and scanned the ledge for a path. A narrow trail snaked up the canyon wall, hidden by a jut of rock. If he could reach Reed unseen, he might disarm him before the others arrived. But the girl's safety came first. He needed her out of that cave, away from Reed's rifle. "Reed!" John called, his voice sharp, cutting through the dawn's stillness. The man stiffened, his rifle swinging toward the sound. John ducked lower, his heart pounding. "You are trespassing on my land. Leave now, or you will not leave at all." Reed's laugh was cold, echoing off the rocks. "Brother Harper, you meddle in God's work. The lamb belongs to the shepherd, not some rancher playing hero." His words dripped with contempt, but John heard the edge of doubt. Reed was loyal to Ward, but he was not the preacher. He could be rattled. John edged toward the trail, his rifle slung across his back to free his hands. The climb was steep, the rock crumbling under his fingers, but he moved with the precision of a man who had faced death before. Memories of Apache skirmishes flashed. Nights spent crawling through these same canyons, outwitting warriors who knew every shadow. Reed was no Apache, but he was dangerous, a fanatic armed with belief. John reached the trail's end, a flat outcrop 10 feet below the ledge. Reed's back was to him, his attention fixed on the cave. The girl was still inside, her silence a fragile shield. John drew his knife, its blade a dull gleam in the dawn light. He could rush Reed, disarm him, but the risk was high. If the girl panicked, if Reed fired, the consequences were unthinkable. Instead, John picked up a stone, its weight solid in his palm, and tossed it toward the canyon floor. It clattered against the shale loud enough to draw Reed's gaze. The man spun, his rifle sweeping the darkness below. "Show yourself, Harper!" he shouted, his voice cracking. John seized the moment, hauling himself onto the ledge in a single, silent motion. He was 5 feet from Reed when the girl moved. Her small form darted from the cave, her bandaged wrists flashing as she lunged for the trail. Reed whirled, his rifle rising, but John was faster. He tackled Reed, the impact driving both men to the ground. The rifle skidded across the ledge, teetering on the edge. Reed's fist caught John's jaw, a burst of pain that sparked stars in his vision, but John held firm, pinning the man's arms. "Stay down," he growled, his knife at Reed's throat. The girl froze, her eyes wide, torn between flight and trust. Reed's lips curled into a sneer. "You cannot stop him, Harper. The shepherd's will is eternal." John pressed the blade closer, a thin line of blood welling on Reed's skin. "Your shepherd is a butcher." "Where are the other children?" Reed's eyes flickered, not with fear, but with fanatic glee. "Safe in God's embrace, where she should be." He nodded toward the girl who flinched, her hands clutching the cave's edge. John's anger surged, but the hoofbeats were louder now, a thunder that shook the earth. Ward's men were minutes away. John bound Reed's wrists with his own belt, dragging him to the cave's mouth. "Inside," he ordered the girl, his voice urgent. She hesitated, her gaze locked on Reed, but obeyed, slipping into the shadows. John shoved Reed after her, his knife still drawn. The cave was shallow, its walls damp and cool, offering temporary cover. The girl pressed herself against the rock, her breathing ragged. John knelt beside her, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You were brave," he said. "But we are not safe yet. Stay here until I call you." She nodded, her eyes holding a spark of courage he had not seen before. He stepped back to the ledge, retrieving Reed's rifle and his own. The hoofbeats were a roar now, dust rising from the eastern trail. 6 riders emerged, their black coats stark against the desert's red glow. At their head rode Elias Ward, his white beard flowing like a prophet's, his staff topped with a carved lamb. His pale eyes scanned the canyon, locking onto the ledge with predatory precision. John's blood ran cold. Ward was not just a man, he was a storm, his presence bending the world to his will. "Brother Harper," Ward called, his voice resonant, carrying the weight of a sermon. "You harbor a lost lamb, a child marked by sin. Return her to God's path, or face his judgment." The riders fanned out, their hands resting on revolvers, their faces hard with devotion. John stepped into view, his rifle raised, the cave hidden behind him. "No lambs here, preacher," he replied, his tone steady. "Just a man who does not take kindly to trespassers." Ward's smile was thin, a blade's edge. "You defy the Lord's will, Harper. The girl has seen truths she must not share. Her soul and yours hang in the balance." John's mind raced. The girl's escape had forced Ward's hand, but his words hinted at something deeper. She knew something, a secret that threatened his empire of fear. John glanced back at the cave where she hid with Reed, her courage holding against the terror of recapture. "If your God demands children in chains," John said, his voice rising, "he is no God of mine. Leave my land, Ward, or the desert will bury you." The riders shifted, their hands tightening on their weapons, but Ward raised his staff, holding them in check. "You speak of justice, Brother Harper, but you stand alone," Ward said, his eyes glittering. "The lamb's tracks led here, and God's truth cannot be hidden." He gestured to the canyon floor, where the girl's footprints mingled with Reed's. John cursed silently. The desert had betrayed her path, and Ward's men were closing in. The preacher's voice softened, a mockery of mercy. "Give her to me, and you may yet find salvation. Defy me, and the blood of the innocent will stain your hands." John's grip on the rifle tightened, his shoulder aching from the climb. He was outnumbered, outgunned, but the girl's trust burned in his chest, a fire no fanatic could extinguish. Behind him, a faint sound came from the cave, a shuffle, a muffled grunt. The girl was moving, perhaps freeing herself from Reed's presence. John's heart sank. If she emerged now, Ward would see her, and the standoff would erupt into chaos. He needed time, a distraction, anything to shift the odds. "Preacher," John called, stepping closer to the ledge's edge, "you talk of God, but you act like the devil." "What kind of salvation builds crosses for children?" Ward's face darkened, his calm cracking for a moment. The riders murmured, their loyalty tested by John's words. Ward raised his staff again, its carved lamb catching the dawn's light. "You will see, Harper," he said, his voice low, venomous. "The Lord's work is not gentle, and neither are we." The air grew heavy, the desert holding its breath. John knew the next move would draw blood. The girl was behind him, her fate in his hands, and Ward, with his army of fanatics, was ready to burn the world to reclaim her. The desert air crackled with tension, the dawn's light sharpening the edges of the canyon walls. John Harper stood on the ledge, his rifle steady, his eyes locked on Elias Ward below. The preacher's pale gaze burned with righteous fury, his staff raised like a scepter of judgment. 6 riders flanked him, their black coats billowing in the wind, hands poised on revolvers. The girl, still hidden in the cave behind John, made no sound, but John felt her presence, her courage, a fragile thread holding him to this moment. Thomas Reed, bound inside the cave, was silent, but John knew the fanatic's loyalty to Ward could spark at any second. The hoofbeats of more riders echoed faintly from the east, a reminder that Ward's forces were growing. Time was a noose, tightening with each breath. "Brother Harper," Ward called, his voice a velvet blade, You stand at a crossroads. Return the lamb, and God may yet spare you. Defy me, and this valley will be your tomb." His riders spread out, forming a semicircle at the canyon's base, their shadows long and jagged. John's mind raced. The ledge gave him cover, but it was a trap, exposed on 3 sides, with the cave as the only retreat. The girl's secret, whatever she knew, had driven Ward to this brazen assault. John needed to protect her, to buy time, but the odds were a stacked deck. "You call her a lamb," John shouted, his voice carrying over the rocks. "But you treat her like prey. What truth is she hiding that scares you, preacher?" Ward's smile faltered, a crack in his divine mask. The riders exchanged glances, their faith wavering under John's challenge. Ward's staff lowered slightly, his eyes narrowing. "She is a vessel of sin, Harper, her tongue poisoned by rebellion. Her purification is God's will, and you obstruct it at your peril." The words were a sermon, but John heard the fear beneath them. The girl was a threat, not just a victim. A sound came from the cave, a faint scrape, the girl shifting against the rock. John's heart lurched. If she emerged, Ward would see her, and the standoff would explode. He needed to act, to shift the balance. "If your God demands blood," he said, stepping to the ledge's edge, "come take it yourself. Or are you too holy for a fight?" The taunt was a gamble, meant to draw Ward's focus. The preacher's face darkened, but he did not move. Instead, he raised his staff, the carved lamb catching the sun. It was no gesture of peace. It was a signal. The riders drew their revolvers in unison, the metallic clicks echoing like a death knell. John dove to the side, rolling behind a boulder as the first shots rang out. Bullets chipped the rock above his head, showering him with dust. He returned fire, his rifle's report thundering through the canyon. One rider clutched his shoulder, toppling from his horse, but the others pressed forward, using the canyon's base as cover. Ward remained still, his staff upright, his eyes fixed on the ledge like a hunter sighting prey. From the cave came a cry, not fear, but rage. The girl burst onto the ledge, her small form silhouetted against the dawn. She held a rock, her bandaged wrists trembling as she hurled it at Reed, who had freed himself and lunged for her. The rock struck his temple, staggering him, but he grabbed her arm, his face twisted with fanatic zeal. "You will not escape the shepherd," he snarled. John spun, his rifle swinging toward Reed, but a bullet grazed his arm, forcing him to duck. Pain seared through him, blood soaking his sleeve, but he kept his eyes on the girl. She fought like a cornered animal, kicking and clawing at Reed. Her courage ignited something in John, a fire that burned through his fear. He surged forward, tackling Reed before the man could drag her back into the cave. They hit the ground hard, the impact jarring John's wounded arm. Reed's fist slammed into his ribs, but John drove his elbow into the fanatic's jaw, stunning him. The girl scrambled free, her eyes wide with defiance. "Run!" John shouted, pointing to the canyon wall behind the ledge, where a series of ledges led to higher caves. She hesitated, her gaze locked on John, but another volley of gunfire from below forced her decision. She sprinted for the trail, her small feet slipping on the shale. John rolled to his feet, grabbing Reed's dropped rifle and firing at the riders to cover her escape. A bullet struck the rock near his head, too close, and he dove behind the boulder again. Ward's voice cut through the chaos, calm and venomous. "She cannot hide, Harper. The Lord sees all, and so do I." John glanced up, seeing the girl climb, her frail form struggling against the steep rock. She was exposed, a target for any marksman. John made a desperate choice. He abandoned the boulder, sprinting toward the canyon wall to draw the fire. Bullets tore through the air, one catching him in the shoulder, spinning him like a top. Pain exploded, a white-hot brand, but he kept moving, his boots pounding the earth. He reached the base of the wall, pressing himself against the rock as the girl disappeared onto a higher ledge. Ward's men were closing in, their horses thundering up the canyon's edge, but John had bought her seconds. Precious, fleeting seconds. He turned, raising his rifle, but a figure loomed above. Joshua Tate, another of Ward's men who had scaled the opposite side of the ledge. Tate's pistol gleamed, aimed at John's chest. "For the shepherd," he hissed, his finger tightening on the trigger. John dove sideways, the bullet slamming into his chest instead of his heart. He hit the ground, blood spreading across his shirt like spilled wine. Each breath was a knife, his lung torn, but he was alive. The girl's scream echoed from above, not of fear but of anguish, as if she felt his pain. Tate advanced, his pistol trained on John's head. "The lamb is ours, Harper. You die for nothing." But the girl's scream had shifted something. From the south came a new sound. Hoofbeats. Not Ward's men, but heavier, disciplined. John's vision blurred, but he saw them. A U.S. cavalry patrol, 12 strong, carbines raised, led by Lieutenant Daniel Hayes. Their blue uniforms were a stark contrast to the desert's red, their arrival a miracle John had not dared hope for. "Elias Ward!" Hayes shouted, his voice a whip crack. "Drop your weapons or we will cut you down!" Ward's riders froze, their revolvers half drawn as the cavalry fanned out, surrounding the canyon's base. Ward's face twisted, his divine calm shattering. "You cannot stop God's work!" he screamed, raising his staff like a weapon. Tate, still looming over John, swung his pistol toward the soldiers, a fatal mistake. Hayes fired, the bullet punching through Tate's skull, dropping him like a stone. John coughed, blood flecking his lips, and crawled to the canyon wall, his eyes searching for the girl. She was on the ledge above, her small form pressed against the rock, safe for now. Ward's men threw down their weapons, their fanaticism crumbling under the cavalry's guns. Ward stood defiant, his staff trembling in his hands, but Hayes advanced, his carbine steady. "You are under arrest, preacher," he said. "For kidnapping, murder, and every sin you have dressed in Scripture." John's strength was fading, his vision darkening, but he clung to the sight of the girl. She looked down at him, her eyes no longer empty but fierce, a survivor's fire. The desert had tried to break her, but she had fought back. And so had he. The desert sun climbed higher, its heat pressing against John Harper's blood-soaked chest. He lay slumped against the canyon wall, each breath a jagged struggle, the bullet in his lung burning like a coal. Above, on the ledge, the girl peered down, her small face etched with fear and defiance. Her eyes held John's, a silent vow that she would not run, not now. Below, Lieutenant Daniel Hayes and his cavalry had Elias Ward and his men surrounded, their carbines glinting in the morning light. The preacher's staff wavered, his pale eyes darting like a trapped animal's, but his followers, disarmed and outnumbered, knelt in the dust, their zeal broken by the reality of steel. "Elias Ward," Hayes called again, his voice steady as granite. "You are finished. Surrender, or the desert will claim your bones." Ward's lips curled, a sneer of divine arrogance. "You wield man's law, soldier, but I serve God's. These lambs are mine, their souls bound to his kingdom." He gestured toward the ledge, where the girl flinched, her hands gripping the rock. John's heart twisted. Even cornered, Ward's voice carried a venom that could poison hope. John tried to rise, his wounded arm screaming, but his body betrayed him, slumping back against the stone. Hayes advanced, his carbine trained on Ward's chest. "Your kingdom is a cage, preacher. Drop the staff or I will send you to your God myself." The cavalry tightened their circle, horses snorting, their hooves churning the red earth. Ward's men murmured, fear replacing fanaticism, but the preacher stood tall, his white beard stark against his black coat. For a moment, John thought Ward would fight, would call down his twisted heaven in a blaze of blood. But then, with a slow, deliberate motion, Ward let the staff fall, its carved lamb thudding into the dust. "Take me," he said, his voice low, "but the Lord's work endures." The soldiers moved swiftly, binding Ward's wrists with rope, his men following suit without resistance. John watched, his vision blurring, as Hayes knelt beside him, his face grim. "Harper, you look half dead. Stay with me." John coughed, blood staining his lips, and forced the words out. "The girl, safe. 4 more children. Devil's Canyon. Find them." Hayes nodded, his eyes flicking to the ledge where the girl watched, her small form a shadow against the sun. "We will get them," he said, then turned to his men. "Sergeant Carter, take 6 men to the canyon. Follow the smoke. Bring those children back." As the soldiers rode out, their hoofbeats fading into the desert's hum, John's gaze returned to the girl. She had not moved, her eyes locked on him, as if her will alone could keep him alive. Hayes followed his gaze and climbed the canyon wall, his boots sure on the shale. "Come down, little one," he called, his voice softening. "You are safe now." She hesitated, her bandaged wrists trembling, but she obeyed, descending with careful steps. When she reached John, she knelt beside him, her small hands hovering over his wound, as if she could will the blood back into his body. "You fought," John whispered, his voice a rasp. "You are stronger than he knows." Her eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, a spark of pride breaking through her fear. For the first time she spoke, her voice a cracked whisper, raw from disuse. "Emily." John's breath caught. Her name, a gift, a reclaiming of herself from Ward's shadow. "Emily," he repeated, the word anchoring him against the pain. "I am John." Hayes returned, a canteen in hand, and pressed it to John's lips. The water was warm, tasting of metal, but it steadied him. "We will get you to a doctor," Hayes said, signaling 2 soldiers to prepare a stretcher. John shook his head, wincing. "Not yet. The children... I need to know." Emily's hand found his, her fingers cold but firm, and she pointed east toward the canyon, holding up 4 fingers. Her urgency mirrored his own, a shared resolve to see this through. The hours that followed were a haze of pain and waiting. The cavalry kept Ward and his men under guard, their black coats now dust-streaked, their faces hollow with defeat. Ward sat apart, his hands bound, his eyes staring into the distance as if communing with a god who had abandoned him. Emily stayed by John's side, her presence a quiet strength. She did not speak again, but her silence was no longer fear. It was focus, a survivor's vigilance. John clung to consciousness, his mind fixed on the children in the canyon, their fates tied to the smoke he had seen. As the sun reached its zenith, a shout broke the stillness. Sergeant Carter's men returned, their horses lathered with sweat. 4 children, 3 girls and a boy, all thin and pale, rode with them, their eyes wide with disbelief. They were scarred, their clothes torn, but they were alive. When they saw Emily, they cried out, a sound of relief and joy that pierced John's heart. Emily ran to them, her arms wrapping around the smallest girl, their tears mingling in the dust. The children clung to each other, a family forged in suffering, their bond stronger than Ward's chains. Carter dismounted, his face grim but satisfied. "We found them in a camp, locked in a tent. Ward's men put up no fight, cowards without their preacher." He glanced at Ward, who did not look up, his silence damning. Hayes nodded, then turned to John. "You did this, Harper. You and her." He gestured to Emily, who stood with the children, her hand still clutching the smallest girl's. John managed a weak smile, pain flaring with the effort. "She did more than me," he said. The soldiers prepared to move, loading Ward and his men onto horses for the ride to Tucson.
Ward's eyes met John's as he was led away, a flicker of hatred in their pale depths.
"The Lord's work is never finished," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Hayes shoved him forward. "Your work ends in a cell, preacher."
Or a noose. The children watched, their faces hard with a justice they were too young to name. Emily stood tallest among them, her chin lifted, her scars a testament to her survival. As the cavalry readied John for transport, Emily knelt beside him again. She pressed the bone lamb into his hand, its carved words, "The pure shall inherit," now a relic of Ward's defeat. "Keep it," she whispered, her voice stronger now. "So you remember." John closed his fingers around it, the bone warm from her touch. He did not need the carving to remember her, or the desert's lesson. Some fights were worth the cost. The stretcher carried him away, the canyon walls fading as the sun burned overhead. Emily walked beside him, her steps sure, her silence no longer a wound but a promise. The desert had tried to break them both, but it had failed. The Arizona sun hung low, its golden light softening the harsh edges of the valley where John Harper's ranch stood. 6 months had passed since the canyon standoff, and the desert, once a battleground, now whispered of peace. John sat on his porch, his chest still tight from the healed bullet wound, the scar a map of survival. The bone lamb rested in his pocket, its carved words, "The pure shall inherit," a reminder of the fight that had changed him. Across the yard, Emily chased a stray chicken, her laughter ringing like a bell, a sound that had been unthinkable when he first found her. The girl who had been silenced by Elias Ward's cruelty had found her voice, and with it, a home. John's recovery had been slow, each breath a battle against the damage in his lung. The cavalry's doctor in Tucson had worked miracles, but the true healing came from Emily. She had stayed by his side, her small hands steady as she brought him water, her eyes fierce with determination that he would live. In those quiet days, as fever burned through him, she had told him fragments of her story, not with words at first, but with gestures, drawings in the dirt, and eventually, a voice that grew stronger with each telling. Her name was Emily Carter, taken from a mining town 30 miles south. Ward's men had stolen her in the night, the first of 5 children he meant to purify for his twisted vision of salvation. The other children, Clara, Hannah, Samuel, and little Grace, had been returned to their families, their tearful reunions a balm to John's wounds. But Emily had no one left, her parents lost to a mine collapse years before. So she stayed, and John did not question it. The ranch had become their sanctuary, its timber walls a shield against the desert's ghosts. John taught Emily to ride, to mend fences, to read the stars that burned above the canyon walls. She learned quickly, her curiosity a spark that lit the house with life. Yet her scars remained, literal and hidden. At night, she woke from nightmares, her cries echoing until John sat by her bed, his voice steady as he promised no cross would ever bind her again. He understood her fear. His own dreams carried Ward's pale eyes, the preacher's staff raised like a curse. Ward and his men had faced trial in Tucson, their crimes laid bare before a judge who sentenced them to hang. John had not attended, but the news reached him, carried by a cavalry rider. The desert had claimed its justice, but it could not erase the past. This morning, Emily knelt in the garden, her hands in the soil as she planted seeds for spring. Her dress, new and blue, was streaked with dirt, but her face glowed with purpose. John watched, his heart full in a way he had not known since his brother's death. Michael's memory no longer cut. It warmed, a reminder that family could be chosen, not just born. Emily looked up, catching his gaze, and grinned, holding up a seedling. "It will grow tall," she called, her voice clear, no longer a whisper. John nodded, his throat tight.
Like you, he said, and her smile widened, a light no fanatic could dim. A horse's hooves sounded in the distance, steady and unhurried. John's hand instinctively moved to the rifle leaning against the porch, but he relaxed as he recognized the rider, Circuit Judge William Hayes, Daniel's uncle, who had ridden through the valley every season to settle disputes and sign papers. The judge dismounted, his gray hair catching the sun, and tipped his hat to Emily, who waved from the garden. "Morning, Harper," Hayes said, his voice warm. "She's thriving out here. You both are." John stood, wincing slightly as his chest twinged. "The desert's been kind," he said, gesturing to a chair. "What brings you?" Hayes sat, pulling a document from his satchel. "Official business, but the good kind. The territory's willing to make Emily's place here legal. Adoption, if you want it." He spread the paper on the table, its ink stark against the weathered wood. John's breath caught. He had thought of Emily as his own, had felt it in the quiet moments when she read by the fire or laughed at his bad jokes. But to see it written, to make it real, stirred something deep, a hope he had buried long ago. "What does she need to say?" he asked, his voice low. Hayes glanced at Emily, who was now chasing the chicken again, her laughter floating across the yard. "She needs to agree, and you both sign. I will witness it." John nodded, his eyes on Emily. He called her over, and she ran to the porch, her braid bouncing, her hands still dusted with soil. "Emily," John said, kneeling to her level, "Judge Hayes has a question about staying here with me here." "For good." Her eyes widened, searching his face, then the judge's. She had learned to read men's intentions, a skill born of survival, and she saw no deceit. "Forever?" she asked, her voice soft but sure. John nodded, his hand resting on her shoulder. "If you want it. This is your home, but it can be official." "Family?" The word hung between them, heavy with meaning. Emily's lips trembled, but she did not cry. Instead, she threw her arms around John, her embrace fierce, her face buried in his shoulder. "Yes," she said, the word muffled but unwavering. John held her, his own eyes stinging, and looked at Hayes, who smiled, sliding the pen across the table. They signed, John's hand steady, Emily's careful, her letters precise despite the dirt on her fingers. Hayes added his signature, the ink sealing their bond. As the judge rode away, his horse kicking up dust, Emily stayed on the porch, her hand in John's. The desert stretched before them, its red canyons no longer a threat, but a promise. "We will plant more tomorrow," she said, her voice bright, "and maybe get a dog." John laughed, the sound deep and free. "A dog, huh?" "You will have to name it." She grinned, already thinking, her mind alive with possibilities. That night, as stars burned above the valley, John sat by the fire, the bone lamb on the table. Emily slept in her room, her breathing even, her nightmares fewer now. The desert had taken much, his brother, his solitude, nearly his life. But it had given more, a daughter, a purpose, a fight worth winning. John closed his eyes, the fire's warmth on his face, and knew the truth Emily had taught him. The pure did inherit, not through chains, but through love.